Have you ever kept a family secret for decades? I won't ask what, just curious.
I wasn't expecting anything that day. Just another quiet Friday in my apartment, the same beige walls, the same creaky radiator that clanked every time the heat kicked in, and the same lukewarm cup of coffee I'd reheated twice and never drank. I had one email to finish before dinner, a minor update to the investor dashboard, but my mind kept drifting. The hum of the city outside my window was dull, gray, like background static in a life that had gotten used to silence. Silence was safer, quieter, less judgmental than my family's voices echoing in my head, most of them saying some version of the same thing. She's still figuring things out, or worse, she had so much potential. And then my phone buzzed. I thought it was Mike at first. We'd been finalizing version 3 of the platform, and I was waiting on his test results, but it wasn't him. It was the family group chat. That chaotic little pit of condescension I had long stopped replying to. Still, I tapped it open out of habit. Maybe someone died. Maybe someone was born. Maybe someone just wanted to show off a new casserole recipe. Nope. It was Amy. Of course it was Amy. My sister, older by 3 years, had always a little too high in the air, smile always a little too rehearsed, sentences always laced with a subtle flick of superiority. She had written, casually, as if the words weren't acid poured on my skin, "Tonight's dinner is just for those doing something with their lives. Hope everyone can make it." No smiley face. No softener. Just that. For a second, I sat there, the phone still in my hand, unsure whether to laugh or throw it against the wall. The heat kicked on again, hissing like it agreed with her. And it stung, not because it was unexpected. She's been making comments like that for years, but because this time, she didn't even bother pretending I was invited. Not even the courtesy of exclusion with plausible deniability. Just a statement. A declaration. As if to say, this is the family now. You don't count. I didn't respond. What would I say? That I was launching a tech company behind the scenes? That I'd signed 3 private beta contracts in the last month? That Mike and I had secured silent backing from a former CTO of a Fortune 100? None of that would matter. Not to Amy. Not to my parents, who always looked at me like I'd made the wrong turn 20 years ago and never found my way back. Not to my cousins, who posted baby milestone photos like Olympic medals. They wouldn't understand. They never did. Instead, I opened the fridge, took out a half-finished container of Thai leftovers from 2 nights ago, and put it in the microwave. I didn't even bother plating it. Ate it right out of the box, standing in the kitchen, the yellow light overhead flickering every few minutes. I could hear my upstairs neighbor vacuuming again. I wondered if Amy had vacuumed before the dinner. I bet she had. She always liked things clean, curated. Perfect. When I finished eating, I washed the plastic container, left it to dry, and sat on the couch in silence. I didn't cry. That's not how I process things. I just sat there, letting the weight settle. I had never been good at pretending things didn't hurt. I just got good at hiding it. I didn't scroll Instagram. I knew they'd be posting. The matching wine glasses, the curated charcuterie board, the kids in color-coordinated outfits. Amy always made it a thing. And I wasn't in the pictures. I was never in the pictures. The clock ticked toward midnight. The apartment dimmed as I turned off one light after another. I brushed my teeth, stared at my own face in the mirror, wondering if this was it. If this is what the rest of my life was supposed to be, good ideas, late nights, and a constant, bitter undertone of being the family disappointment. Then, right as I reached for my phone to set the alarm for the next morning, a buzz. Not a notification buzz. A different one. Email. I glanced down. The subject line made me pause. Forbes, Founder of the Year 2025, How Lena Burke Built the Future in Silence. My breath caught somewhere between my chest and my throat. I opened the link, hand shaking just slightly. There it was. A full-page feature. My name in bold. My picture, the one Mike took in the co-working space 3 months ago, when I'd insisted I wasn't camera-ready, right there on the front page. A quote in the sub-headline. They all told me I was failing. I wasn't failing. I was building. Forbes had run the story early. Our PR guy was going to tell me in the morning, but they pushed it because one of our beta users, a small business owner in Wisconsin, had gone viral last night for tripling her revenue using our platform. The traction was explosive. We were no longer stealth. We were real, visible, unignorable. I sat there, phone in hand, the cold from the window brushing against my back, my heartbeat thudding in a rhythm I hadn't felt in years. Not since before I failed publicly. Not since the time my demo crashed in front of a full investor panel, and Amy had said, maybe you should try something simpler, like marketing or yoga. That night haunted me. I remembered every syllable. And now I was looking at something undeniable. I clicked the article link again. It wasn't a dream. By the time the clock struck 12:30, my inbox had exploded. Old bosses, former classmates, friends who ghosted me. Even my ex from grad school, the one who said I was too intense about the whole ambition thing. And, of course, Amy's husband, Brian. Wow. Didn't know you were working on something so big. Huge congrats. Everyone at dinner is talking about it. I didn't reply. Not yet. I leaned back against the couch, phone resting on my lap, and let the silence wrap around me again. But this time, it felt different. It wasn't emptiness. It was power. Still, quiet power. The kind that doesn't ask for attention but demands it anyway. I closed my eyes and thought about that dinner, about the look on Amy's face when she finds out. I didn't have to say a word. I had already won. But the story was just beginning. I didn't sleep that night, not because of excitement or adrenaline, but because something far more complicated was boiling just beneath the surface of my skin, a strange cocktail of vindication, restraint, and the quiet fury that had kept me afloat for the better part of the last 3 years. I sat there for hours, in the same spot on my worn-out couch, the fabric thin in the places where I'd spent too many nights alone, watching cheap LED light flicker across the hardwood floor as notifications continued to pour in like a flood no one had warned me about. My inbox, long a barren wasteland of automated updates and cold investor intros, had become a stage for the great family performance of sudden admiration. Everyone, it seemed, had something to say now that someone else had decided I mattered. The first email was from Uncle Jeff, who hadn't texted me in 4 years, not since he drunkenly asked me at Thanksgiving if I was still doing that startup nonsense, like I was playing house with code and delusion. He wrote, "Saw the Forbes thing, super impressive. Proud of you, kiddo. Would love to hear more about what you're building." I stared at his words and tried to remember a time he had asked me anything about my life that wasn't followed by a smirk or a patronizing pat on the shoulder. I couldn't. Next came cousin Melissa, who had posted 6 pictures from that family dinner earlier in the night, tagging everyone but me. She wrote, "You're blowing up, girl. We should totally do brunch sometime. I have this idea I've been dying to pitch you." That one made me laugh, not out of humor, but that bitter, quiet laugh that comes from seeing just how transparent people can be when they think you've finally become useful to them. And then there was Amy. She didn't email. She texted, like always, her messages formatted with perfect punctuation, like she was drafting a press release instead of writing to her sister. "Just saw the article. Wow. So proud of you. Everyone at dinner is talking about it. Let's catch up soon." No mention of the earlier text, no apology, no acknowledgement of the line she drew in the sand mere hours ago. Just the careful, curated words of someone trying to spin the narrative before they lose control of it entirely. I didn't respond. I needed time, not just to think, but to feel the full weight of what was happening. Because it wasn't just about the article, and it definitely wasn't about validation from people who had doubted me for so long. It was about the years that led up to that moment, the sleepless nights, the near misses, the times I almost quit, and the choice I made, again and again, to keep going even when I had every reason to believe it wouldn't matter. Mike had once told me that the best revenge isn't loud. It's not shouting from a rooftop or throwing someone's words back in their face. It's becoming so undeniable that silence is all that's left for them. And as I watched message after message roll in from people who had once looked right through me at family gatherings, who had dismissed me as unfocused or flaky or not really career material, I understood what he meant. I had never raised my voice. I had just kept working. It all started 3 years ago, after the pitch that failed so hard it became a family punchline. I'd gotten in front of 15 people at a mid-tier accelerator, pitched a half-formed version of the platform that would later become Clara, named after my grandmother, the only one who ever believed in me without needing proof, and watched in real time as the whole thing crumbled. My demo crashed, my numbers didn't make sense, and I froze. Completely froze. Couldn't speak, couldn't breathe, couldn't even explain what the hell I was trying to build. Amy was there that day, had come along because I had begged her to, needing someone in the room who felt like home, and afterwards she patted my shoulder and said, "Hey, at least you gave it a shot," like I was a toddler who had lost a game of checkers. That night I cried. Not because I failed, but because I realized there was no room left for mistakes in the eyes of people who had already decided I wasn't capable. That was the moment I decided to disappear, not entirely, but just enough. Enough to work without commentary, to build without explanation, to let my life become something private, protected, and far away from the scrutiny of the people who had never really seen me in the first place. I moved into a smaller apartment, got rid of the distractions, said no to every social invite that didn't feel genuine. I called Mike, an old colleague who had once told me over lunch that he believed in my instincts even if I hadn't figured out how to shape them yet, and I pitched him something new, a small, powerful software tool built specifically for women-owned businesses, giving them insights into revenue flow, customer engagement, and predictive scaling, using AI models we trained from scratch. It started simple, but the potential was enormous. For the first year, we paid ourselves nothing. 8 canned beans and hacked together code from second-hand laptops. I freelanced on the side, designed websites for small nonprofits, anything to keep the lights on. But we kept building, and eventually, we got our first angel investor. Then our first client. Then another. We stayed off the radar. I didn't even tell my parents. I wanted it to be mine, fully mine, untouched by their judgment or Amy's well-meaning condescension. And now, here it was. Out in the open. The article didn't just praise the product, it told the full story. My story. The setbacks, the silence, the build. It didn't paint me as a genius, but as someone who kept going, who didn't quit, who made something real without needing applause. And suddenly, the applause was deafening. By 4 a.m, I was exhausted but wired, the kind of tired that comes after a long, quiet war you finally realize you've won. I sat by the window, knees pulled to my chest, watching the sun creep up over the edge of the skyline. The light hit the glass in that same soft way it always did, like nothing had changed, like the world was still the same. But I had changed. I wasn't in the shadows anymore. And as I looked at my phone again, at the flood of messages from people who had once looked at me like I was wasting space at the dinner table, I didn't feel the urge to respond. Not yet. Because they were still talking. Still trying to rewrite the story now that they realized it had value. But for the first time, I had the luxury of waiting, of choosing not just how to respond, but if I would respond at all. And that, more than anything, was the power they never expected me to have. When I finally did respond, it wasn't because I needed to. It wasn't about closure or reconciliation or extending some kind of magnanimous olive branch to people who had only just remembered I existed once the headlines did. It was because I wanted to look Amy in the eye and hear how she'd spin it, how she'd wrap herself around the story like ivy on a tree, acting as if she'd always supported me, as if she'd always known I had it in me. As if that snide little text she sent 2 nights ago had somehow meant something different than exactly what it meant. So when she texted again the next morning, chirpy, casual, like we were old friends meeting up after a yoga class, and said she'd love to grab coffee and catch up, just the two of us, I replied that I'd be free Thursday morning, 10 o'clock. At that little cafe near the train station she always used to call a bit too gritty for my taste. I chose it deliberately. It wasn't a bad place, good coffee, quiet corners, a few mismatched chairs, and just enough city noise bleeding in through the windows to make everything feel alive without being overwhelming. But Amy hated it, which made it perfect. She showed up on time, of course, hair in that tight, polished bun she wore like armor, Sunglasses perched on her head, not a wrinkle on her cream-colored blouse, even though it was already 80 degrees and humid enough to melt pavement. She spotted me sitting by the window and walked over with that familiar half-smile, the one that didn't quite reach her eyes, the one she used at every PTA meeting and holiday photo session, the one that said, "This is what polite looks like even when I don't mean it." She sat down without waiting for me to stand, leaned in, and with all the subtle grace of a corporate HR rep trying to fire someone nicely, she said, "Lena, I mean it, I'm so proud of you." The article was amazing. Just, wow. I nodded, sipped my coffee, and didn't answer right away. I let the silence stretch between us, thick and awkward, until she blinked and added, "You really surprised everyone." In the best way, of course. I didn't smile. I wasn't angry, not anymore. I'd moved so far beyond that place it felt like watching someone else's life on a screen. I was simply curious to see how far she'd take the performance, how carefully she'd rewrite our shared past to make herself look like the sister who never doubted, never judged, never excluded. And, predictably, she leaned in, voice lowering like we were sharing secrets, and started talking about how hard it had been to keep everyone together lately, how mom and dad just worry about you, you know, and how nobody really meant anything by it that night, and how family can be rough, but we always come through in the end. I let her go on. I watched her twist the narrative, like watching a magician fumble through a trick everyone already knew the mechanics of. She asked questions, too, or rather, the kind of questions people ask when they don't want answers, only opportunities to steer the conversation towards something safer. What was it like getting that article published? Were we hiring? What kind of clients were we targeting now? She mentioned that her daughter, Megan, now 15, apparently had really shown some promise with math and might be interested in computer science. Maybe I could talk to her? Mentor her a bit? That's when I almost laughed. Not because the idea was ridiculous. I had nothing against Megan, who'd always been polite, if quiet, around me, but because it was so typical of Amy to immediately pivot from exclusion to access the moment there was something to gain. One minute you're not invited to dinner, the next you're being asked to mentor the golden child. The calculation was transparent. She was already mapping out how to weave me into the family tapestry again, now not as the embarrassment, but as the success story, the cousin to be bragged about at brunch, the sister whose achievements could somehow elevate the entire family brand. So I played along. I smiled, just slightly, and said I'd be happy to talk to Megan. And as I said it, a new idea took root. Not a petty one, not childish revenge, but something far more satisfying. I told Amy that, in fact, I was planning something soon. A dinner. Small, intimate, nothing flashy. A gathering of the people who'd believed in me, who'd supported the build, who had done the work and carried the weight without needing praise or fanfare. I said it casually, dropping just enough detail to pique her interest without making it sound like a setup. Her eyes lit up the way they used to when someone mentioned designer sales. She asked who'd be there. I shrugged and said I was still finalizing the list. She didn't say it outright, but I could see the gears turning behind her eyes, the anticipation, the quiet panic that maybe she wouldn't be included, maybe she'd be left out of the one thing now that actually mattered. She leaned in and said, "You should definitely send an invite. I think the whole family would love to celebrate you." I just nodded. Let her believe it. When we finished our coffee and stood to leave, she pulled me into a hug that was just stiff enough to feel rehearsed, and she said again, "So proud of you." Really? I didn't say anything. Just watched her walk back to her car, heels tapping against the pavement, shoulders back, head high, as if this whole meeting had been her idea, her gesture, her grace on display. But the truth was, she had no idea what was coming. She had no idea that I had remembered every word, every side glance, every backhanded comment. She had no idea that this wasn't just a catch-up. It was a chess move. The board was set. And the next move? That would be mine. It took me less than 48 hours to decide I was going to do it, not out of spite, not even to prove a point, but because something inside me, something that had been waiting patiently beneath the surface of all those years of quiet endurance, finally began to stir with a clarity I hadn't felt since the day I decided to go silent and build. This wasn't about payback in the way children dream of revenge when they're wronged on the playground. It was about returning the energy I had been served, but on my terms, in my tone, and with the precision of a woman who'd spent years watching, listening, and remembering who showed up only when it was convenient to be supportive. I wasn't interested in rubbing anyone's face in my success. That would be too easy, too small. What I wanted was to create a space that looked, sounded, and felt exactly like the one I had been excluded from, only this time, I would be the one writing the guest list, the one holding the door, and the one deciding who got a seat and who stayed outside wondering how the hell they missed the invitation. The planning was meticulous, not because it had to be, but because I wanted every detail to carry weight, to say something without saying it directly, and to make people feel, if only for a moment, that same uncertain emptiness I had felt when I ate my leftovers alone while my family laughed over wine and roast chicken just a few miles away. I rented out a rooftop space downtown, not the most expensive place in the city, but tasteful, elegant, with floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the skyline and caught the sunset in a way that made everything glow. I hired a private chef, someone I'd met during my freelance days when I was still designing restaurant websites to pay the bills, and I told him I wanted the menu to feel indulgent but familiar comfort food, elevated just enough to suggest that something simple could, in the right hands, become something unforgettable. The invitations went out via email, not as digital flyers or e-veets, but as personal notes, typed, printed, and scanned into PDFs with minimalist letterhead. At the top of each was a line, written in the same clinical tone my sister had used when she excluded me: "Dinner is for those doing something with their lives." That was it. No explanation. No emoji. No warmth. Just a mirror placed delicately in front of them, daring them to ask if they were still welcome now that the tables had turned. I sent invitations to exactly 20 people. Not one more. Not everyone I knew, not even everyone who had reached out after the Forbes article, only the ones who mattered, the ones who had been there before the headlines, who had offered help without knowing there would ever be anything in it for them. Mike, of course, got the first one, hand-delivered. A few early beta clients, small business owners, most of them women juggling 3 jobs and 2 kids, received theirs next. My old writing professor, the one who'd emailed me a year ago just to say he was proud I hadn't given up. A former roommate who once lent me $300 without asking when I couldn't make rent. People who had believed in me when believing in me wasn't fashionable or profitable. And yes, I sent one to Amy. Not because she had earned it, but because I wanted her to feel what I had felt. Not rejection. Not even bitterness. Just the sharp awareness that something meaningful was happening without her input, without her control, without her being at the center of it. The night of the dinner arrived with a quiet tension that buzzed beneath my skin. I dressed simply, a dark green wrap dress I'd bought 2 years ago but never had the confidence to wear, hair pulled back loosely, no jewelry except a thin gold chain that had once belonged to my grandmother. I arrived early, walked the space slowly, checked the lighting, the table settings, the wine bottles lined up behind the bar. Everything looked perfect, not overdone, not flashy, just quietly, confidently excellent. Guests began to arrive just before 7, and the air filled with soft laughter, clinking glasses, the low hum of jazz floating through the speakers. People hugged, reconnected, shared stories of what they'd built and survived and were still working toward. There were no speeches, no toasts, no spotlights, just an atmosphere that made everyone feel like they had earned their seat at the table because, in one way or another, they had. And then, just before 8, Amy walked in. She was wearing her version of casual elegance, expensive heels, designer bag, hair glossy and controlled, and she looked around the room like someone trying to assess a space that wasn't built with them in mind. She smiled when she saw me, that same diplomatic curve of the lips she'd used in the coffee shop, and walked over with an energy that suggested she had already decided how she was going to talk about this dinner when she posted about it later. "You've outdone yourself," she said, glancing around, taking in the view, the people, the vibe. "It's beautiful. So intimate." I nodded, returning her smile with something quieter, more restrained, and gestured for her to sit. She wasn't the center of attention here, and she knew it. Dinner was served in courses: hand-rolled gnocchi, seared salmon with lemon caper sauce, slow-roasted vegetables. Conversation flowed around the table like music, and Amy, for the first time in my memory, was silent. She wasn't driving the narrative, wasn't explaining or managing or showcasing. She was just present, and maybe a little lost. As dessert arrived, a delicate hazelnut tart with cardamom cream, I finally turned to her and said, "It's funny. When you sent that text about dinner being for people doing something with their lives, I remember wondering if you even realized what that would sound like to someone who'd just spent 3 years building something you never bothered to ask about." Her eyes widened, just slightly, not in shock but in recognition, the way someone flinches when they know they've been caught, not in a lie, but in a truth they hoped would stay buried. I wasn't angry, I continued, my voice calm, measured, almost soft. But it made something very clear to me, that what I'd been waiting for all these years, some kind of acceptance or acknowledgement, wasn't ever coming. And that was actually freeing. She opened her mouth, perhaps to defend herself, perhaps to offer one of those lukewarm apologies that smooth over the surface without ever cleaning out the rot underneath. But I held up a hand, not rudely, but gently. "I just want you to understand something," I said, leaning in slightly. "You weren't wrong. That dinner wasn't for me. And this one isn't for you." I stood then, not dramatically, just enough to move on to the next conversation, the next guest, the next moment that was mine. And as I walked away, I didn't feel vindicated or superior. I just felt light, like I had finally put something down I'd been carrying for too long. But Amy? She sat quietly, watching the room continue without her. And that silence, the one she had once gifted me, finally returned home. The days following the dinner passed in a blur that was both surreal and strangely quiet, like the calm that comes after a storm you had spent years preparing for, only to find that when it finally hit, you didn't need to take shelter. You had already built the kind of foundation that didn't crack under pressure anymore. My phone, which had once felt like a battleground of silence and obligation, now buzzed with a different kind of energy, the kind that felt performative and overly eager, as if the people who had ignored, overlooked, or minimized me for so long were now trying to overcompensate for the way they had vanished when I had nothing to show but a tired face and an overdrawn bank account. Suddenly, I was everyone's success story, everyone's cousin worth mentioning, everyone's family redemption arc in the eyes of those who had once labeled me a cautionary tale. I didn't respond to most of it, not because I was angry, but because I was finally learning the value of selective silence, the kind that isn't rooted in insecurity or avoidance, but in the deliberate preservation of peace you fought like hell to earn. Messages poured in from relatives I hadn't seen in years, vague invitations to catch up over lunch, breezy compliments hidden inside manipulative praise, and the ever-popular, "We're just so proud of you, Lena, we always knew you had it in you," which was perhaps the most dishonest sentiment anyone could have sent, because the truth was, they hadn't known, and more than that, they hadn't even cared to find out. I ignored the group chat entirely. The same one where Amy's text had landed like a slap just days before. Now it was flooded with pictures from the rooftop dinner, pictures they hadn't taken, moments they hadn't lived, names they hadn't learned. Somehow, through the twisted miracle of social perception, my dinner had become the family's dinner, something they wanted to reference, absorb, and lay claim to, as if presence were equal to participation. As if showing up late meant the same as building from the ground up. Amy sent a thank you note the next morning, of course. Not handwritten, not even a card, just an email, short and sweet, the kind that corporations send when they decline an applicant they never seriously considered. She wrote that the dinner was exceptional, that she was so impressed by what I'd created, and that she hoped we could find time to reconnect more meaningfully in the coming weeks. There was no apology. Not even a hint of acknowledgement for the years she had spent slowly erasing my credibility with every passive-aggressive jab and backhanded compliment. It was as if she'd decided we were even now, as if her mere presence at that dinner had somehow absolved the years of absence. And maybe, in her mind, it had. My parents were quieter. My mother, who had spent most of my adult life trying to pretend I wasn't drifting away from the version of daughter she understood, left a voicemail, soft-voiced and meandering, asking how I was feeling and whether I might come by the house sometime soon for dinner, just us, just to talk. There was something in her tone that sounded real, not guilt, exactly, but a kind of hesitation, like she knew something had shifted but didn't yet have the words to name it. My father didn't call. He sent a one-line email, terse and impersonal, saying the article was well-written and he was glad to see I was staying productive. That was all. No warmth, no pride, just a checkbox ticked under familial duty. I didn't reply to either of them. Not because I didn't love them, but because I wasn't ready to do the emotional labor of pulling them into a narrative they had chosen to watch from the sidelines for so long. I had learned that success doesn't heal old wounds, it just makes them visible in a different light. And now that the spotlight was on, they were scrambling to clean up the mess they had ignored in the dark. What stayed with me most, though, wasn't the buzz or the attention or even the satisfaction of seeing Amy sit in silence at a table she once denied me. It was the realization that I didn't feel the way I thought I would. I had always imagined this moment with a kind of cinematic flair, the triumphant return, the stunned expressions, the apologies spilling over themselves in the face of undeniable achievement. But real life doesn't grant you that kind of closure. It gives you something quieter, something slower, a shift in gravity, not a thunderclap. And that shift was both empowering and deeply isolating. Because once you stop needing the validation you once craved, you also lose the illusion that those people were ever capable of giving it. The longing disappears, but so does the tether, and in its place is a kind of quiet distance that doesn't ache, but doesn't warm you either. I stood in that space, uncertain and calm, realizing that in becoming who I needed to be, I had also become someone they could no longer recognize. Mike and I met the following weekend to debrief over drinks. He asked me how I was feeling, really feeling, not the polished version I gave investors or the smiling responses I reserved for interviews. And I told him the truth. I said I felt like I had arrived at a place I didn't know I was walking toward, and now that I was here, I wasn't sure whether I was supposed to sit down or keep moving. He nodded, like he understood exactly what I meant. And maybe he did. Before I went home, I opened the drawer where I kept the letter from my mother, the one she wrote me after my pitch failed, the one I never opened because I assumed I knew what it said. Next to it, I placed the note she sent me after the dinner. Both were sealed. Both untouched. One was written in disappointment. The other, in belated admiration. I didn't open either. Not because I didn't care, but because the act of not reading them meant more to me than the words ever could. They were symbols now, artifacts of a version of my life that no longer held the same power. I framed the Forbes article, not because I needed to see it every day, but because I wanted one tangible reminder that I had done something real, not for applause, not for family, not even for legacy, but for myself. I hung it above the refrigerator, where I used to keep my stack of takeout containers, the same place I had stood alone with a plastic fork the night they had their dinner without me. And now, every morning when I make coffee, I see it. Not as a trophy, but as a timeline, a mark of the moment the silence broke, and I no longer needed the dinner table they had once used to measure my worth. They still gather, still post their pictures, still laugh in their curated little gatherings. I haven't been to a family holiday since. And maybe I never will. But sometimes I think about Amy. I wonder if, in the quiet moments, she ever regrets sending that message. I wonder if she realizes what it cost her, not just the humiliation of being outshined, but the permanent loss of a relationship that might have grown into something real, had she only chosen to see me before the world did. I don't hate her. I don't miss her either. Because in the end, I didn't just become founder of the year. I became someone they can't reach anymore. And honestly, that feels like the real win.